Hello and welcome to another School of Feminism and Religion podcast known as FER School Podcast. I'm Anna Bobic and I'm extremely excited to talk about feminist theology, probably because I consider myself to be one. The reason for my excitement is certainly that I'm talking about feminist theology with Tina Beattie. Greetings, Tina.
Greetings, lovely to be with you.
For those who do not know, Tina is a British Christian theologian, writer, and a broadcaster. On her own site, she will cite that she's also a grandmother. I find that to be an important part of our identities, a mother, of course. Beattie's theological contribution is notable in the areas of Catholic theology and psychoanalytic theory, gender and sexuality, Marian theology, theology and literature and arts, atheism and religion, women's rights. She's a long-standing advocate of a more prominent role of women in the Catholic Church. I am sure that I have missed very important parts of your biography because it is such a rich biography. But for those interested more, Tina has also had experience with being banned for what she does in the field of advocating women's position in church. I would say so. Tina, have I missed something?
No, I think that's plenty. Thank you.
So let's start for the beginning. I want to ask you, when I say I'm a feminist theologian, people ask me, what? And they don't see the relevance. So for the beginning, I would ask you, is and how feminist theology socially relevant today?
I think it's as relevant as it has been really since it emerged, because we see today all over the world a resurgence of the oppression of women and misogyny, whether that is openly expressed or whether it's more subtle. So we look at the Taliban in Afghanistan and some of what's happening to women in Iran, for example, for extreme examples. But then we look to the United States of America and the re-election of Donald Trump, and we see a really rather oppressive, worrying kind of politics in the ascendancy, which is not good news for women who value equality and dignity and freedom.
Mhm.
So, feminist theology brings some of these questions into the church, and we look at the ways in which interpretations of scripture and in the Catholic Church, church teaching contribute to that worldwide trend in all religions and cultures to see women as subordinate, as unequal, as inferior, even when that gets masked by liberal rhetoric. It's just beneath the surface all the time. And as a Catholic theologian, I think church teaching on women is a very powerful driver of that subtle or not so subtle misogyny. And I see my calling as to work with that, not in conflict with the church. I love the Catholic Church. I am a Catholic, but I think we have to be able to bring voices of creative and constructive criticism when we see really serious failures in church teaching, which actually undermine its central message of the beauty and dignity and redemption of all creation in Christ. And the church's teaching on women does not honour that vision.
You also tell the women of faith that feminist theology can affect them, benefit them.
Women of faith know in their own lives how church teaching affects them. Now, there are conservative women who may be in good marriages, who may have children, who may find that the status quo works very well for them, and they might realize that it's actually an insecure and frightening world out there if you don't have those securities and supports. And sometimes those are the women who will resist feminist theology and want to uphold church teaching exactly as it is. Now, nothing in me wants to denigrate those women, but Christianity is not about giving greater security to those who are already secure. It's not about giving greater certainty to those who have no doubts. I think it's the very opposite. It's meant to disrupt us and open our eyes to what we might not readily see. So I think we need to make feminist theology relevant to women's lives by asking them to reflect on where they have experienced church teaching in ways that have enriched and liberated them, but also in ways that have imprisoned or oppressed them, often quite subtle ways. How many women just allow themselves to be uh, chained to domesticity because it's quite frightening to break free. And we can't just suddenly throw down tools and say, I'm not doing this. But I think we need to find a language that all women can share and relate to ask, where is it that you would really like your life to change, and to see how viable is it? Can we help to make that change? And can your faith become a liberating vision for you instead of perhaps keeping you down? But that also means listening to women in different cultures. I'm very aware, that if I speak, for example, to feminists in the US or Germany, they have a very high idea of autonomy, and women's ordination might be very high on their list of priorities. Whereas if I speak to women in Southern Africa or Eastern Europe, for example, domestic violence and poverty and the lingering effects of war and social unrest might be more important for them. I think by the time we get to issues of ordination, we're probably living in quite secure societies where we're not dealing with the daily fallout from serious recent histories of conflict, as of course people in your region are.
Absolutely. You mentioned language, and that's a great intro to my next question. You claim, if I read you correctly, I will paraphrase, that feminist theorists and theologians ask us to think about what happens when the female body is revealed in the world of language that was constructed by others in order to silence and make them passive in the process of production of meaning. Women are thus placed in a social and cultural context that they did not create and where they are interpreted without even being asked anything.
Yes, it's true. You know, Heidegger says we inhabit the house of language. And of course, today we know that our lives are shaped through the inseparable relationship between culture and nature. We are born with a certain givenness of embodiment and capacity, but then our cultures give us the languages and the the visions and the ways in which we make meaning of our lives. And what feminists like me would argue is that those meanings have been projected onto women as the excluded other of the masculine subject. So in modernity, certainly the construction of the male subject goes with certain values of autonomy, of rationality, and all the aspects that any human has of dependence, of vulnerability, of emotion are projected onto the feminized other. So women become the recipients, and not just women. It happens from a very early age. A baby is born and already dressed in pink if it's a girl. And research shows that mothers handle their daughters more gently than they handle their sons. So women are groomed from very early, from the beginnings of life, to see ourselves as nurturers, carers, relational, responsible for those sides of life. And of course, those sides of life are very important. They're too important to say only one sex has responsibility for them. So women today are saying, what language would express who we are in ways that are not just projections of a masculine image of femininity, but are actually ways in which women experience and live our lives. An example would be today the church celebrates the Feast of the Immaculate Conception because it was yesterday, which was a Sunday. And I was reading Pope Francis's homily, which is very funny. He gave his homily to 21 cardinals, but he said the church is a woman. We must all be more like Mary. But it's a very sentimental image of Mary. It's a sort of projection of a romantic image of what a woman is. And then I read Mary's Magnificat, and it's a cry of jubilation and liberation. And, this is not a meek, subdued woman who sings the Magnificat. She is absolutely full of the freedom of God, and that's not an easy freedom. It will bring her enormous heartache and suffering. So she has courage, she has a voice, she preaches. The first one to preach Christ is the Magnificat when she meets Elizabeth. And we need to reclaim these voices and say, these are the voices we speak with. These are the voices that women change history with.
Sometimes I get frustrated for me in Mary, I see a woman who made an autonomous decision that basically changed the world as we know it. Yet all the time we're hearing Virgin Mary, Virgin Mary, Virgin Mary, like she was a passive person, if even a person, not some kind of an icon, who who just had no active participation in what happened. And she had a very active participation, and it was an autonomous decision of a very young girl in a social context that would not look nicely on a young girl in her position.
No, she risked everything, absolutely everything. We don't even know that she was a young girl. I sometimes think maybe it took her many years to work out that she was being called to something very radical. And it's also why I defend the doctrine of the virgin birth, not because it's a sign of sexual purity, but because it's a sign of God's power without any domestication or interference. Today we still talk about virgin forest, virgin ocean, and Mary's virginity is that kind of raw power of nature as created by God. And she doesn't have to go to Joseph and say, "Oh, shall we have a nice dinner and go to bed?" Because that's not how it happens. It is God and a woman together agree to the incarnation. And that has huge ramifications, of course, about women's ordination. Mary is the one whose yes incarnates Christ. And today there's no reason why a woman's yes can't incarnate Christ in the Mass.
In your work, as we are hearing right now, you deal a lot with the analysis of church documents. And we started this conversation actually already. A lot of church documents put a rather heavy burden of caring for society on women. As you already said, there is this burden of responsibility of care for others on women, yet not on whole humanity, which should be the case.
Yes, women become the silent models of how people should be, and yet they still keep us out of the Vatican and any positions where that modeling could have real sacramental significance. I mean, if you read church documents, they have so much to say about women. They have very little to say about men. I mean, Pope Francis talks a lot about clericalism, and it is shifting. But they say so much about women and they don't quote a single woman theologian. I mean, in the last 50 years, thousands of women have studied theology at universities, biblical studies, thousands and thousands of books and articles and groups. They never refer to those. So, Pope Francis keeps saying we need a greater role for women in the church. And I'm a great admirer of Pope Francis. I think he's a wonderful, wonderful example of Christianity. But I'm afraid he really does have a romantic unreal idea of women, and he's so against idealization. He so wants us to be a living church in touch with the grassroots reality, and yet he seems unable to see that the grassroots realities of women's lives are nothing like what we read about in church teaching documents. So I think there needs to be a real change of culture. And Pope Francis, more than any other pope, has said he wants that. He calls for a new way of doing theology. And yet, the best way of doing that would be to learn from women theologians, even in his environmental theology. Laudato Si, his 2015 encyclical on the environment, is a wonderful document, but it's gendered throughout. Mother Earth, Sister Earth. But he says nothing about real women who are in the front line of sustainable development projects, of changing cultures to sustainability. So again, even his environmental theology, and if the church is to go forward with a vision of a sustainable ethos, it has to be done with a different understanding of both nature and the female body.
Mhm. The female body sometimes sounds like a battleground, not only in religion, but in our secular societies as well. And it seems, I had a question that it seems to me that the documents that have something to say on the women's questions are not written from the position of understanding women and the woman's question, but rather to justify the position of women in the gender hierarchy. I'm sorry, hierarchies,
Hierarchy, yes, yes,
gender
absolutely.
hierarchy community. Excuse me, everyone. Um, uh, but then listening to you and talking about Pope Francis, and on the other hand, I'm like, I don't necessarily see this agenda to justify the position in the hierarchy. Sometimes it's just like, I'm sorry to say this, but they don't have a clue. And we're
They
saying, like,
don't.
we are here to give you answers about us women, but no one wants to listen.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the challenges they face is that, until the mid 20th century, most of the world, in all religions and cultures, believed that just God made women to be subordinate to men. And in the 20th century, there was a revolution in consciousness about gender relationships. And so suddenly the church found that it couldn't rely any longer on that old theology of male authority and female subordination. Now it had to find a different reason why women can't be priests, but it also had to say women and men are fully equal. So it came up with this idea, largely thanks to the theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar and Pope John Paul II, of complementarity. So the sexes are equal but different. But nothing has changed. If you read what equality and difference means, it means what it has always meant. Men define women and tell us who we are. We're different, but it seems that difference isn't so significant that they have to ask us what it's like to be a woman. They talk about us, they talk for us, but they don't let us speak.
The complementarian model sounds to me just like a bad excuse for actually not even changing a subordination model, not even considering the egalitarian model that is also present in the church tradition, so to say. So, attitude towards women and the roles in the church, current situation in the church, but we also have the strengthening, you talked about it in the beginning, the strengthening of the ultra conservative currents within the context of the Europe, USA, the whole world, um, Western world, I have to say that. And how do we take this attitudes towards women in this ultra conservative context with the context of the document Gaudium et Spes that states that men and women created by God are equal in the abilities of reason and the divine mission, so that any form of discrimination, social or cultural, based on gender, race, class, language, religion, should be overcome and eradicated as contrary to God's plan. We're in a contradiction.
We are, but they don't see that as a contradiction. They don't see it as discrimination. It's as if, so when I was employed by a university, it would have been a mistake for me to say that the fact that somebody is the vice chancellor and has authority over my working life is discrimination. It's not, those are our roles in an institution. Now, the attitude that still prevails is that God made creation like those institutions, that women are just naturally subordinate to men. And if it's natural, it's not discrimination. And underneath complementarity, that is still what they think, or they would not be able to speak for us and define us. But it also has a really tragic impact on the church's ability to enact its wonderful social teaching. Catholic social teaching, and now with the environment included, is the richest resource the human family has today for bringing about a more just and peaceful and sustainable world order. But it's completely in contradiction to the gender and reproductive politics of the church. So lots of Catholics voted for Donald Trump. His social ethos could not be further from Catholicism, but people just see abortion. And I'm not minimalizing that, I'm not making light of it. But at the same time, so much of it is, in fact, about the control of women's bodies, no contraception, no abortion. Underneath, it's about control. And I'm not therefore saying we must just take on what secular society does on these things. We must bring wisdom to bear about the dignity of human life, women's lives, children born and unborn. Again, there's a lot in church documents about unborn children. There's hardly anything about the rights of children who are born. And we need to change that. We need to say if human life matters, it matters at all stages and ages. And if you have a society that thinks that its ethical framework is upheld by refusing women access to abortion, but then also refusing their children access to healthcare, education, housing, a social environment in which a child can flourish, that is anti-life. It's not pro-life. To be pro-life means to have a passion for life at every stage and to recognize that life is vulnerable in many stages, and much of that we can change by our social and political values. So I think the church is, by not aligning itself more robustly with women are ethical agents. We don't need to be told what to do with our bodies and lives. There are really wonderful books of feminist ethics. There are responsible ways of thinking through these issues that could shape church teaching in ways that would not violate doctrine. But why aren't they reading those things? Why aren't they engaging all the while with the rhetoric of inclusivity and equality and we must include more women? Well, hey guys, let me take you to a library and show you where you can start reading. How many books do you want?
Because women have written a lot of books, even in the field of
A lot.
moral theology, about abortion, about
Mm.
the whole debate is is uncomfortable because to me it they just sound like they're fetishizing fetus, and they're doing it in a moment where we are not enabling living people, born children, nothing but war around us, crisis, the crisis of democracy if we are on the West, but the crisis of life everywhere because of the climate change, because of the social situation, as you already stated, the health systems, etc., etc. We could go on for days. It's
Yeah,
all connected, but it's all kind of suppressed, and everything sounds like a fetishization of a fetus, which
you're right.
I don't see it as Christian question. It shouldn't be a Christian question. But when we are talking about the control of women's bodies, as you said it, despite all the advances that we have done in the emancipation of women, the bodies of girls and women are still the object of great cruelty. You write about it as well. And even if we put aside the question around violence against women, there are numerous mechanisms of cruelty against women's bodies that are more sophisticated, that are, that are less visible than the question of violence against women, which is also a very important question, but it's not just about direct violence against women.
Well, it's a cruelty to say that women are not allowed any control over their own procreative capacities when around the world women are subject to rape, coercion, inside and outside of marriage. You know, if women can't protect themselves against unwanted pregnancies, and the church has very little to say about the male role in these situations. I mean, it will pay lip service to male violence, but let's talk about men. Let's just stop talking about women, men in the church. You know, let women talk about ourselves and you talk about men for a change. You know, every aborted fetus has a father. Go find the fathers and give them some catechism if you want, if you really want to make a difference. You know, why is it only ever women? And you know, it is also, I think, it's a product of the romanticization of women, that then women who are not always nurturing, self-giving, tender, are demonized. So Pope Francis says women who have abortions are like hiring hitmen. Well, that's terrible for a man who lived in Argentina, who was close to the poor. I mean, I know he went on the streets with sex workers to visit them, with the people in the slums to visit them. He knows that reality. He doesn't surely believe that, you know, those are all women hiring hitmen if they can't cope with pregnancies. It's just, there's a lack, I think, in all his good intentions, and I don't doubt them. And it's common to many men in the church who are much less compassionate than he is to connect what they're saying with the realities of life. And if you romanticize women, you will also demonize them. You will also, you know, see women who don't live up to this ideal as wicked and dangerous and even more needing to be controlled. You know, I read Pope Francis's homily, as I was saying to the cardinals, the new cardinals today, and he was talking about Mary sacrificing her own life to love others, giving up everything to love others. And you can't talk like that unless a woman has a deep sense of self, not to give up, but to offer. We cannot offer of ourselves if we've never been allowed to develop a self. And I think we all probably know this from our personal histories. You know, we're brought up with these models and whatever happens, we get into relationships, we have children, and we do turn into demons sometimes because nobody told us this was going to be so hard. We don't naturally get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to feed a baby that's crying and shitting itself when we want to go to sleep. You know, that's not natural to us. We need to learn these things. And because we internalize these things, we can end up not having the kind of maturity of self that you need to have to genuinely give of yourself to others without resentment, without anger, without self-loathing. And so it's not just about what men say and do, it's about the responsibility we women must take to resist those narratives and to say, what does it mean for me to be a mature and confident person capable of giving and receiving love? And I think that's a very difficult question. And I think it's one we women often don't deeply ask ourselves. What does it take for me to become a fully formed adult?
And often not having a context where you can even accomplish it. Unfortunately, a reality for
Mhm.
many women in the world. I love how you said that they should talk about men. So again, we have a contradiction that women, as Mary, should be giving themselves self-sacrificing, claiming Jesus to be a man. Of course, we know this is wrong, wrong in a theological field, that we don't understand God in gendered ways, etc. But this is the traditional or conservative discourse, and yet, who is a bigger example of giving himself for the humanity than Christ? So it sounds to me often like taking the authority, but not taking the responsibility that goes with this authority. And it's also connected to the question of our ontological purposes. Men, I mean, you're not letting us women to talk about us women. I had a panel discussion, and then we were talking about how Pope Francis, no, Pope John Paul II, I'm sorry, claimed that the ontological meaning of women is to be a mother, if not in a real, then in a spiritual way. And then I asked women in the audience, have anyone ever asked you what you feel your ontological purpose is? And everyone was like, what have you here? So this was very indicative for me. This I think is where you really touch the problem with a simple claim. Maybe you should talk about men and let us talk about women.
Yeah. But also, Christianity has never posited a double ontology. We are ontologically human, made in the image of God. We're
Exactly.
ontologically creatures like all other creatures. Those are the questions of ontology we should be asking. But also, for me, it's very important that the incarnation was in a male body, because if Jesus had been a female body, he would just have been fulfilling the worst female stereotypes. He deconstructs masculinity. In his relationship with God, he deconstructs God and he deconstructs patriarchy. He abdicates authority. He becomes a servant. He embraces us all as his brothers and sisters. And the thing to me that is hidden in plain sight in the Gospels is that he gives his story to women to tell. It's the men in the Gospels who get it wrong, who get rebuked. It's the women from the moment of the Annunciation. So even before that, when the angel goes to Zechariah, the male priest in the temple, and Zechariah says, "How can my wife get pregnant?" The angel zaps him and he can't speak until the baby is born. And then it's the mother who is told to name the child. Now, in a patriarchal culture, women don't name the children. Then with Mary, she asks the same question to the angel, but unlike the priest, she doesn't get silenced. She gets answered. She's also told to name the child. And then, the angel says, "No, there's two, your cousin Elizabeth." So she is given another woman to accompany her. And this image that we're offered of Mary being so humble that even although she was pregnant, she made this journey to go and see Elizabeth. That's nonsense. Women seek each other out in times like that. She went looking for Elizabeth with all her heart. And the first wonderful homily we ever hear is when these two pregnant women embrace, and Elizabeth recognizes the mother of her Lord, and Mary sings the Magnificat. It's a wonderful beginning of the story of the Incarnation. In John's Gospel, Mary initiates the first miracle. It's the women who are at the foot of the cross. It's the women who witness the resurrection. Jesus doesn't choose to tell his story through men. And yet, why have men only ever thought they have the authority to tell the story? Women can't even preach in mass. So if Mary Magdalene was around today, she wouldn't be able to tell the church about the resurrection. So, well, she'd have to go
Exactly.
and tell the men and they would pass the message on. But these are the ways we can be playful and we can laugh about these things. I think that's also a lovely aspect of feminist theology. We don't always need to be complaining and we can laugh and we can tease and we can tell the story differently, flamboyantly and creatively. But while we do it, we must be holding the hands of our sisters who can't speak, who can't laugh. And yeah, we must be there with them. We must speak with them always.
If you ask me, laughing about it is a coping mechanism.
Yes, it is. Men know what to do. When women cry, when women get angry, they know what to do. But when women laugh, my goodness, what do we do with these laughing women? So I
I
think we must laugh.
absolutely. I mean that the good news is joy. Joy is the good news. So we
Yeah.
have to remember that all the time. I think we will have to do another podcast on feminist exegesis and hermeneutics because it's a
Yes.
really such a rich place. Women in theology have done such an amazing job in the field. But for the end of this conversation, I would like to ask you again a question that is more concerned with the social context, and that is um, you also claim that Christian women today are quite in a situation where the demands of feminism and the demands of the religious communities are so polarized that it results in a state of alienation, conflict, and confusion. May be these, may, may this be the space for feminist theology?
Yes, I think feminist theology has to have a voice where those two movements meet in the margins with some turbulence, because there is a lot about a theological vision that I think can inform secular feminism. There are aspects of secular feminism that lack, I think, the sort of dimension that theology brings to our understanding of life. So I don't think I never I'm never persuaded by feminist theologians who just obey what secular feminism says we should do. I don't like it when it's as if progressive, liberal, secular culture is the ideal we aspire to. It's not. And as we see today, it's collapsing. Um, and part of that collapse is a polarized discourse where people don't listen to each other and try to find a middle ground where we can dialogue. It's not possible when people are really set in their ways, but that can be true of so-called progressives and conservatives. These issues like abortion, like gay marriage, so many of the issues that people take up positions on. And we're not persuading each other, we're not listening to each other. So, yes, feminism and feminist theology and secular feminism, I think it's changing, to be honest. I think as secular liberalism loses its meaning, as it disintegrates into populism, I think there is a sense that we need to deepen the questions we ask. And of course, theology and philosophy are where we need to go if we're going to deepen those questions. And I sense in the last few years a more openness in secular society. And Britain is where I'm speaking from is very secular. But there is less hostility today than I think there was 5 or 10 years ago to the questions that theologians, feminist theologians, ask of feminism.
Thank you, Tina. I really do hope we will have chance to speak again to open the questions of how we do interpret the Bible as well from the feminist perspective, and even soon enough stop seeing the works of women in theology as just women's studies and really start to engage these interpretations in systematic theology. I really think that we are closer to that place every day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope so. Thank you, Lana.